Good morning. How are you? It is raining, so I'm glad everybody brought umbrellas. It is about 10 o'clock, and it looks like there's still a few people kind of coming over to the crowd, so I thought I would just start with some introductions while we wait. Thank you all for coming out this morning despite the weather, and I'm glad we're able to do the cemetery tour this year. If you're new and you haven't been on a tour before, or if you've been, I'm still going to give a refresher. I am Molly, and I work at the Niles History Center. This tour is an annual partnership between the History Center and the Friends of Silverbrook, a nonprofit group that works in the cemetery. They do a number of things. They do a lot of the cleanups around the cemetery. They give money for various projects throughout the year, and they help sponsor this tour and plan for it as well. So I'll give a couple introductions here. One of the things I want to talk about, if you've been on the tour before, we always do the photos a little differently, and I feel like every year I'm trying to find the best way to do the photos on the tour, because I love to add historic images. But with the crowd size, it makes it hard, and sometimes how we all gather up in the cemetery. So the photos for this cemetery tour, I am going to be showing a few throughout the tour. I have them on my tablet. So at the end, if you really want to see something, I can show them to you. But I have a QR code here, and the photos are on the Niles History Center website. So if you would like to scan the QR code now, during the tour, whenever, I'll hand a few of these out. If you want to view them after the tour, they're on our website, nileshistorycenter.org. I'll share that link too on our Facebook page as well. We'll have them up and available, so you can view the photos. They have identifications with them as well. And I'll let you know throughout the tour, like, oh, we have a photo of this, that are part of the photos on the website too. So, but I do have a few of these, so if anyone's interested, we can hand them. If you want to just hand a few of them out. I laminated them. If you want to scan them now, you can follow along on your phone if you would like. So,
anybody else want one?
That's how we're going to try to do it this year. And we'll see. Oh, I've got one more too. Somebody else wants one. Oh yeah, you want to take one? Yeah. Okay. So, all right, I think we've got about everybody. Yeah, you can hand them back to me if you want, or wherever. Okay, it looks like we have everybody. So, a little history of the cemetery, I'll make it brief. In 1836, George Bond purchased the original 6 acres for use as a public cemetery. He purchased more shortly after. It was named for the brook that runs through the middle of it here. We're really close to it here. And the cemetery lots opened for public sale in 1838. Since that time, the Silverbrook Cemetery has experienced a number of additions. So you'll notice, like, the oldest sections are Bond, after George Bond. Other sections include Old Ground, City, New, and Garden of Memory. This is still an active cemetery for the city. Over 26,000 people are interred at Silverbrook. 2. The entryway that everybody came in on is actually the cemetery's 3rd entryway. The first one was along South 11th there. The second one was along Cherry Street, and then this one was the 3rd. The office that you see at the entrance too dates to the 1930s. The old office was actually part of that barn over there today too that we have a good view of. So this year, we will be focusing on the city section of the cemetery. If you were on the tour last year, we also went through the city section. However, we're going to be hitting some different spots this year. We will also be highlighting a few people in the neighboring sections of New and Old Ground on this tour. The city section is interesting because in the 1870s, the cemetery trustees hired someone, his name was Silas Ireland, to lay out the area and create the first topographical map of the cemetery, which was finished in 1878. So when you walk through this area of the cemetery, you'll notice that like late 19th century park-like features throughout it as well. This also is the final resting place for many of like the big, what we call like the big families in Niles at this time period, like some of the industry families and some of the big names, including, of course, I work at the History Center, the Chapin family, and we will talk about that a little bit. So we're going to start heading over this way. Because of the weather too, we're going to try to stay on these main paths as much as possible as well. So looks like we have everybody. We'll start walking and go to our first stop.
Benjamin Cozzens Sr. On this tour, we will be talking about two Benjamin Cozzens. We have Benjamin Cozzens Sr. and Benjamin Cozzens Jr. Both of them served in the military. So this is Sr., this is the older Cozzens. Benjamin Cozzens, he was an African-American man. He was born in Kentucky in 1846. We know he moved to Michigan sometime before the start of the Civil War in 1861. Cozzens was enlisted out of Niles as a draftee in the Civil War on November 2nd, 1863. He served in the 102nd Michigan Regiment, and he was assigned to Company G.
We actually have a few Civil War veterans on the tour this year, and we have a few African American veterans of the Civil War. So I thought I would give just an overview of how about African American soldiers during the Civil War. We have more information on this if you come to the museum. We have a military exhibit on the second floor, and we give more details about Niles people that served during the war. President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation to take place in 1863. This freed all the enslaved people in the Confederate States. The document included a paragraph permitting African Americans to serve in the Union Army and Navy. The 1st Michigan Colored Infantry Regiment was what it was called. It organized at Camp Ward in Detroit and was mustered into service on February 17, 1864, with 895 officers and recruits. The 1st Michigan was later designated the 102nd. They served in states such as South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. 198,000 African Americans served in the military during the Civil War. They made up around 10% of the Union Army. They served in segregated units, and they did face racial prejudice throughout the war. There was discriminatory practices. They often kept black soldiers assigned to non-combat support roles, and they were initially paid less too. Despite these practices, African American soldiers served with distinction. 16 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor for the Civil War. The United States Armed Forces remained segregated until 1948. Benjamin Cozzens Sr. served for 2 years and 9 months. We know he was with Sherman on his march to the sea. He was present at the surrender, Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. After the war, he returned to Niles. We know he worked at Conyers for a number of years before his death in 1930. He was an honorary member of Niles Circle, the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic. Benjamin Cozzens Sr. was married twice, and he had 2 children, both with his first wife. They were Anna and Benjamin Cozzens Jr. We will be talking about them in a little bit. We'll be going by their graves. They're buried with their mother. He is buried, Benjamin Sr. is buried here with his second wife, Sarah. Her maiden name was Redmond, and she died in 1902. When Benjamin Cozzens died in 1930, he was one of the last surviving Civil War vets in Niles and in Berrien County. So the last Civil War vet in Berrien County to died in 1939. So he died in 1930. All right, next we're going to go back onto that main road, and we're going to head back toward the city section. Okay. this is our next stop. We're going to be talking about Anna Sutter and Jeppy Delano too. So if you do go on the website and you look at the photos, we have some photos of them on the website that are from the Niles History Center collection. So we're going to talk a little bit about vaudeville and some of the performers in the 1800s into the early 1900s. So Anna Sutter was born in New Jersey in 1850, but she moved to Niles as a young child. She was an incredibly skilled singer, and at a young age she was part of the choir at the local Methodist church here in Niles. At the age of 7, she was invited to join a group called the Peak Family Swiss Bell Ringers, and her stage name was Fanny Peak. A little bit about the Bell Ringers. William Peak organized the Peak Family Swiss Bell Ringers in Massachusetts around 1838. The Peak family was musically talented, and they played bells along with other instruments. In 1839, they started out on their first concert tour. These were like the rock stars of the 1800s into the mid part of the century. They became very popular. They added talent to their group, including Anna here, Fanny Peak as they called her. In 1866, the Peak family troupe split. The son William and daughter Julia headed west, and the rest of the family played in the eastern and southern states. William H. Peak, son of the troupe's founder, chose Niles as his off-season headquarters. He kind of had an association with Niles before him and his wife were married here in 1855. He was involved with one of the local churches too, as well. But the Peak family, this part of the Peak family, made Niles their base when they were in the off season. They toured the western part of the country until sometime in the 1870s when they disbanded. Anna was performing with the Peaks when she met Jeppy, another member of the group. The two married in 1872. After the Peak troupe disbanded, she and Jeppy went out on their own, and they started vaudeville careers, and they were very successful as well. It was a popular form of entertainment at that time. We know Jeppy was primarily a comedian. Fanny played the bells and the horn, and she was known for having a beautiful soprano voice as well. So they performed in leading theaters throughout the U.S., Canada, and even internationally. After their retirement, they settled in Niles at their home. Jeppy died in 1925, and Fanny died in 1935. Just a little bit about Jeppy too. He was born in 1845 in Charleston, Massachusetts. In his early life, he was a jewelry manufacturer until he was recruited for the Peak family as well. So that's how they met, and they are buried right here too. We are now in the city section of the cemetery that I talked about a little bit, so you'll see more of those park-like features over here. Alright, we're going to keep going to the corner. Okay, as everybody gathers over here, we're going to be talking about two people in this area, or two families, sorry. One is the large marker down there. It says Graves on it. On the other side, it says Morrow. I'm going to briefly mention them. And then we're going to talk about, just briefly here, the Benign family that's here as well. Another older name in the area that many people are probably familiar with. So, we're going to wait for everybody, and then I'll talk about them. So, the Graves Morrow marker over there, that's the final resting place for members of the Graves family and the Morrow family too. So, Henry Andrew Morrow was born in 1829 in Virginia, and he served in the Civil War. He was part of the 24th Michigan Infantry, which was organized at Detroit and mustered into service on August 15, 1862. They were part of the Iron Brigade, too, which they were named for their tough reputation. The Iron Brigade consisted of units from Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan. They fought in several major battles throughout the war, including Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. They had a very famous part of Gettysburg during July 1st to the 3rd, 1863. They suffered significant losses. On the first day, 316 soldiers from the 24th Michigan were either killed, wounded, or missing. Henry Morrow himself suffered an injury and he was actually captured, but he was released on July 4th. So, before returning home toward the end of the war, Morrow actually was promoted to brigadier general. They were also placed on garrison duty, the 24th Michigan, at the end of the war at Springfield, where they were selected to escort the funeral of Lincoln as well. They were mustered out of service on June 20th, 1865. Henry Morrow was a military man, and he continued serving in the military after the war. He was assigned to several places across the country. He died in Hot Springs, Arkansas on February 1st, 1891. But he's buried here in Silverbrook Cemetery. Now, his connection to Niles came from his wife. Her name was Isabella Graves Morrow. They married December 11th, 1860. They made Niles their home for several years, and we know they returned here often during his military leaves of absence. A little bit about Isabella Graves Morrow. She was born in 1836. She was a charter member and member of many of the early women's clubs here in Niles, including the Ladies Historical Society. They actually held their initial meeting at Isabella and Henry's house in January of 1878. It was a group of 10 women. They showed up and they formed a group with the motto, "In essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity." They studied history, including the local level, literature, architecture, museums, etc. They're still actually an active group today too. They're still members of the local Ladies Historical Society. Isabella died on January 21st, 1911. So she's buried over there as well. Her father is buried there. His name was William. He was the Secretary of State in Michigan. He was mayor of Niles for a while. He was in the 11th Cavalry during the Civil War. And her brother is buried there too. His name was Frank. He was colonel of the 8th Michigan in the war. He died in the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864. The Niles GAR chapter, which was the veteran chapter for veterans of the Civil War, Grand Army of the Republic, was the Frank Graves chapter, named after him, her brother. So that's there, the Graves Morrow. And then the other one I wanted to point out here is the Benign family. Many probably know the Benign family from Cass County and the connection to the Underground Railroad. The members of the family that had the house are buried here. So we know Quaker James Benign arrived in Cass County in 1843. He married Sarah Ann Bogue, and in 1844, they were members of the Young's Prairie Anti-Slavery Friends, and they were staunch abolitionists as well. So if you've ever been out to Vandalia to the Underground Railroad Society of Cass County, it includes the James Benign House, the Stephen Bogue House, among other structures. That is this family here. James' brother was Evan Benign. He was a Niles guy, and we will be talking about him later on this tour as well. Kind of an interesting note, too, I learned, because we talk about Benigns are one of the older families, you know, from this era that we talk about that you don't think about a lot of family members here today or people being buried here today. There was a woman named Mary Benign who was recently buried in this section. She was apparently born in the Benign house over in Cass County, and she was the last Benign to own the house. She sold it, and then it was a number of other things until it was sold to the Underground Railroad Society of Cass County. So that's kind of interesting. They just had a small burial here like a couple weeks ago for her. So, all right, next is when we will be going off the road just a little bit. We are going to be highlighting the Woodruff family. The Woodruff family is another name in Niles when we talk about like around the time the village of Niles was founded in the late 1820s, 1830s. They're one of these families from that time period. There are many Woodruffs buried here. If you look, all of these are members of the Woodruffs or related family. It's a huge family plot over here. We are going to highlight just a few this morning, and you can take a closer look if you want to see at some of the markers and stuff. I'm going to talk about one guy. His name was David O. Woodruff, and he was born in 1813. He actually grew up on the East Coast. He lived in Canada for a while. We know he taught school and he was a farmer. He got married while he was in Canada to a woman named Jane Ducombe. She died in 1848. They had one child, Charles. We're going to talk about him in a little while. David moved to St. Joseph, Michigan in the mid-1840s, and in 1849 he followed many others and went out to California following the gold rush there. He returned to the area, he was all over the place, and settled in Niles in 1852. He built a house on the west side of Niles. If you know where Woodruff Street is today, that street was part of his property and farm. He had a farm called Font Hill there too. Let's find the rest of my notes on him. After returning to Niles in the 1850s, he married a second time to a woman. Her name is Clara Hurd Woodruff. She is buried in this area too. David was involved in the formation of the Union School in Niles, and he also helped secure the buildings and grounds for the old Central School. For many years, he was president of the Board of Education. He was also supervisor of the 1st and 4th wards of the city, and he was also repeatedly chosen as president of the Berrien County Agricultural Society. So he was very involved in the community when he was here. He died in 1891. Now, David and Clara, his second wife, had two children, and one was Jenny Woodruff Griffin. If you've been on these tours before, we talk about the Griffin family a lot. They're over in the bond section, in that circle called the Griffin Circle. That's where members of the Griffin family are. But Jenny Woodruff Griffin, some of them are buried here, like Jenny. She was born to David and Clara in 1858. She was involved in a number of local women's clubs, including the Ladies Historical Society and the Club of Home Gardens. She was married to Edwin Clarence Griffin, Eli Griffin's son, and the couple had two daughters, Harriet Griffin and Miss Jean Griffin too. So Jenny Woodruff Griffin actually donated a number of items to the museum. If you come visit the museum, we have a couple items of many items of hers, including a couple spinning wheels that belonged to her grandmother that we recently put on display on the first floor of the museum. I also want to highlight Miss Jean Griffin. That was one of their daughters. She lived from 1887 to 1969, and I know there are people in the community that remember Miss Jean Griffin. She sounds like she was an awesome lady. She was a librarian and avid historian. She spent much of her life in Niles, but she was also a librarian in Duluth, Minnesota, Detroit, and for 20 years she was a librarian at the Kalamazoo Public Library. She also directed the museum there for a time too. She was a member of the State Board of the United Nations Association. She served as delegate at large for the Michigan Division of the United Nations Association. She traveled extensively on its behalf. She was even part of their world tour too. She was a former member of the Board of Trustees of the Fort St. Joseph Historical Association, which were part of the founding of the museum in Niles here. And actually, I found it interesting. On her obit when she died in 1969, it was printed in the paper. There was editor's note that said, out of respect for Miss Jean Griffin, who will be buried Wednesday at 2 p.m., the Fort St. Joseph Museum will be closed in the afternoon. Miss Griffin served on the museum board of trustees for many years. So I know there are people in the community that remember her, and she sounds like she was just an awesome woman. There are other members, like I said, of the Woodruff family that are buried here. There's Charles Woodruff. He was born in 1843. He served in the 25th Michigan Infantry during the Civil War, and he died in 1868. He got tuberculosis, and he came home after the war, but he died of that just a few years later. He actually kept a diary during the war, and there are copies of that you can read at the Niles District Library today, too, if you're interested in some of his experience during that time. There's also another Woodruff I want to highlight before we move on, Helen Ruth Woodruff. She was born in 1873. Her father was John Woodruff, so that David I talked about would have been her uncle. But she was the first assistant librarian in Niles. Like we've talked before about Oral Coolidge was the first librarian in Niles when the public Carnegie Library opened in 1904. She was the first assistant librarian. And when we were doing some research at the library not long ago, we found some documents that she had actually signed as well. So she was known for that for a long time. She died in 1931. So like I said, though, there are so many members of the Woodruff family here, you could take a time to look at all the markers, and you could be here all day, quite honestly. We're going to be heading down this way a little bit. I do want to highlight while you're going by here, you'll notice this is like a large marker for the Lewis, Griswold, and Norton families. Those are some other older names in the Village of Niles history as well. The marker is white zinc, which is a metal prefabricated and would have been assembled at the cemetery. This was a popular style of marker during the 1870s to the 1920s. I read somewhere that they actually called them white bronze because they were trying to sell them in like catalogs and stuff, and they thought that made it sound fancier, like something you could really want to get for your marker, but they were mostly made of zinc. So that's a really good example of it here. Yeah. All right, we're gonna head back to the main road over here. Our next couple stops are over here, and I'm gonna talk first about, you see the flag right here? We're gonna talk about Alex Winborn and his family, and then John here is gonna help me talk about the Chapins up here, too. I feel like I have to talk about the Chapins if we do this tour. But we're going to highlight Alex Winborn here first. He is interesting, and he's somebody we are trying to do more research on at the museum. So what we do know about him, Alexander Winborn, he's sometimes called Winburn in historical documents. He was an African-American man. He was born in Rush County, Indiana, September 24th, 1836. He lived most of his life in Niles. He was a barber by trade. In census records, he is listed as living on 6th Street and on 5th Street, just due north of Cass Street as well. So part of what we would consider the Ferry Street historic neighborhood as well. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He listed in Company K of the 1st Cavalry in Decatur of November 30th, 1863. According to his service records, he was wounded in action. He was discharged in Detroit May 27th, 1865. What we want to know, why we would like to do more research on him, it's very interesting. We were working on some exhibit updates at the museum, specifically on military and things. We came across his name, and we realized he was actually an African-American man who served in a white unit during the Civil War. Not a segregated unit like the 102nd, but he was in that Company K of the 1st Cavalry. After more research, we found that, while not common, it was something that did happen. There was one woman, her name is Juanita Patience Moss. She said she had an ancestor who she found did not serve in one of the segregated units, but instead served in what we would call like a white unit during the war. She went to the National Archives to research this relative and was told by staff there that that was not possible. That's not something that would have happened. She ended up writing a book called The Forgotten Black Soldiers Who Served in White Regiments During the Civil War. And she's uncovering names of people that had a similar military service. So we have found that Alex Winborn also did. We reached out to a local Civil War historian to see if he'd ever come across this. And if he knew of anybody else in the area. He knew of one person, and his name was George Stafford. He was a barber in Dowagiac. He served during the war, and he even survived Andersonville prison. Interestingly enough, in our research too, George Stafford's son was married to Alexander Winborn's daughter, Lillian. So it's all these connections. We would love to know more about his service during the Civil War. If anybody knows anything, or is familiar with the Winborn family, please come talk to me, because we would really like to know more. We know he died October 28, 1908. His obit says he was one of the most well-respected members of the community. He was a member of the Frank Graves GAR post. He was post commander for some time as well. He's buried here with other members of his family. He has a brother named George Winborn who served in the 102nd. We'll be highlighting him. We'll go by his marker. We actually went by it once. We'll highlight it again on the way back here. So, very interesting, and one I'd really like to know more about. While we're here too, you can see the Wilson marker over there. Joel Wilson is another soldier. He served in the 102nd during the Civil War. He also died in 1930, like Benjamin Cousins, making him one of the last surviving Civil War veterans in the Niles area, and in the county really too. So, quick mention there. Now, up on the hill here, you'll see are buried the members of the Chapin family. And as I work at the Niles History Center, if you have not been by the Niles History Center, we are the Chapin Mansion and the Fort St. Joseph Museum, which is actually located in the carriage house of the mansion. So I feel like anytime the Chapins are near us on the tour, we should talk about the Chapins. And I actually have one of our docents who leads tours of the mansion here, John. He's going to give you a little bit of information about the Chapin family.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. The Chapin legacy is basically, as she mentioned, the Chapin Mansion. But it all started with Henry Austin Chapin. And Henry was born in Massachusetts in 1813. His family moved to Ohio in 1814, which turned out to be now known as the Akron era. He had a common school education. He was working at a general store. He married his wife Ruby Nooney in 1836. They moved briefly to Niles, went to Edwardsburg, and he ran a general store in Edwardsburg. In 1846, they moved back to Niles for good. Now, he ran a general store, he sold wool, he sold produce, he was a local businessman. In 1865, he acquired 40 acres of land in the Upper Peninsula. At the time, thought to be not very valuable, maybe just for the timber. In 1878, a mining company approached him about looking for ore on his property. Turns out there was a lot of iron on his property, and it's in the Iron City area. So he got a stipend for every ton of ore that came out of there. And the mine started in 1880 and ran continuously until 1934. So he was making at one time between $100,000 and $300,000 in 1880s money, which would translate it to today, that would mean he's a millionaire. So at that point in time, Henry and Ruby decided to build their dream home. And so that became the Chapin Mansion. Now, it's Queen Anne style. It's decorated in the American aesthetic. And that aesthetic movement was they wanted to put art in your house. And art nourished your soul. Art for art's sake. And so it's very ornate. Stained glass, stenciling, a lot of carving. Henry died in 1898. Ruby died in 1902. Their only remaining heir, their son Charles, then had the estate. He had moved to Chicago. However, the family retained the house and used it occasionally. And they kept a housekeeper and a maintenance guy there. In 1932, after Charles and Emily, his wife, had died, their children, which would have been Henry's grandchildren, decided to divest themselves of the house. So no private buyers could be found because it was way more expensive than anybody could afford, and it was the Great Depression. So the Chapins offered the house to the city of Niles with the proviso that it be used for public good. So it became the city hall, and most of you probably remember that. And it was the city hall until 2012, at which point it became part of the Niles History Center. Now, tours are available of the house, and I'll let Molly talk about that.
Yeah, turn this off, and then I will talk. Okay, thank you for the good overview of the history of the Chapin Mansion. So today, the mansion and the museum are all part of what we call the Niles History Center. If you've been by any time this summer, you will notice major construction going on at the building. They put new roofs, or newer roofs, updated the roofs on both structures. We also got new flooring in the museum. However, if you've been by in the last few days, you'll notice that we are wrapping that project up. They took away the big safety entrance from the museum, so you can actually see the front of the building, and they are actually doing the final work on the mansion, but we're hoping we'll be able to open again for tours soon. So we normally do guided tours of the mansion, so if you want to come and see the house on the inside, learn more about the family and the style of the home and the city history, come see us. We'll have more information on our website. We're getting ready for some holiday events already, believe it or not. The first holiday open house is November 18th. The Fort St. Joseph Museum is open. We'll actually be open from 12 to 3 today. We have 2 floors of exhibits at the museum, and we give a comprehensive history of Niles. So I definitely recommend to check it out. And if you haven't been in a while, come see us again. We're updating stuff all the time, too. So thank you, John, for talking about the Chapins. If you have time and it's less rainy or anything, I recommend coming up and looking at the Chapin marker sometime. It's really lovely, the marker and how it's laid out up there. We are going to be heading back this way just a little bit on the main road. But first, I just want to mention the receiving vault over there. You can see it from here. That was actually constructed in 1869, and it's where they would store bodies in winter months when the ground was frozen or the weather was too severe for burial. There's a historic marker on it that you can read a little more about it, too. They had some issues with it this past spring, and actually part of the structure almost washed away. But the cemetery superintendent, with some work from the Friends of Silverbrook as well, they worked to restore it, and I think it looks great. It's a very historic part of the cemetery. All right, we're going to start heading back on the main road here. We're going to be talking about the Dresden family in a little bit here. But while we are here, I would like to point out, I'll go over here and I'll show it to you guys, the LaPierre. If you would like to stand by LaPierre, I would like to talk about that, but I won't make everyone walk all the way over to LaPierre. Okay. So over there is a marker. It's actually a newer marker for the LaPierre family that was installed in The former director of the museum raised money to install the marker or have it put there, and they give some information on the back. But it is the resting place for members of the Lapierre family. I would like to highlight Mob Lapierre, because he is a connection we have in Niles, Underground Railroad. So I thought we could talk about him a little bit. He was born in Montreal in 1814. He worked as a mason in South Bend. His work included construction on some of the Notre Dame College buildings. We know he moved to Niles in 1838. He continued his trade along with other business interests as well. One of his other business ventures was the operation of the Michigan Central Railroad Eating House, which was essentially attached to the old depot. So people could get off the train, they could go eat. He ran it with his wife, Hester. In 1859, Niles Republican News Story noted that Mr. Lapierre offered food to an African American woman at the depot, who represented herself as an enslaved person who had escaped from Missouri. He gave this aid in contrast to other Niles citizens who, although polite, would not offer this person any food or money. They were in fear of violating some strict penalties and fugitive slave laws of the era. Assisting an African American family found a mob along with 8 other men to defend themselves in the South Bend fugitive slave case of 1850. It involved a Kentucky slave owner, John Morris, who was seeking the return of 6 members of the Powell family, whom Norris claimed were his property. David Powell, his wife Lucy, and their children, Louis, Samuel, George, and James, were living on a farm in Cassopolis when John Norris and a band of men kidnapped 4 of the family members. When several neighbors signed a document attesting that the Powells were free people, a South Bend judge ordered the release of the captives. 2 South Bend abolitionists, Aaron Webster and Solomon Parker, took the Powells from South Bend to Niles, where Lapierre purchased train tickets for the family to flee to Detroit and then on to Canada. Norris appealed the judge's decision, and the Indianapolis Circus Court awarded damages to Norris. The ruling against Lapierre forced him to sell all of his property to pay his part of the fine because of that. So this commemorative marker was put here to honor his life and his efforts in abolition at that time. It's for him and, like I said, his wife Hester, who was born in 1822. She died in 1894. That's actually the same year a mob died as well. Their son Edward is buried here too. If you've been on the cemetery tour before, we've talked about Edward. He was the guy who was involved with the jewelry store and mysteriously was found shot in the cemetery. That story is actually, I think we have a story of it on the Friends of Silverbrook website, but it's kind of a mystery of the cemetery as well. That was their son, too. So, all right, we're going to head up here toward the hill on to the next stop. We're going to talk about this large member in the Dresden family. Before I do that, I would like to just point out over here the marker with all the rocks around it. It's for John Gipner. He was the landscape architect for the Michigan Central Railroad Depot, the depot on 5th Street today, or on 5th and Day there. And today the Niles Garden Club, actually they put a historic marker over there for him, and they plant flowers around his grave there. But he's part of the reason why Niles, for a while, was called the Garden City, because people that came on the Michigan Central Railroad to the depot would receive flowers from Gipner, and he had the landscaping around it that looked really beautiful. At the museum, you can see some historic pictures of it as well. So that's Gipner, and you can check that out. John, would you like to talk about the Dresden family?
We'll start with the original Dresden, William Dresden. William was born in 1853 in Indiana. He went to college at what is now Butler University. and he studied music under a famous professor. So he made his living mostly in the Chicago area, singing, playing the piano, and giving piano lessons. Around 1898, a rich widow approached him about giving her daughter's name was Plowden, piano lessons. Well, the lessons went so well that she decided to take some lessons from him. Well, those lessons went so well that they got married a couple of months later. Now, it might be noted that her name was Adele. Adele was a widow, and her husband had been very prosperous in the lumbering industry. So, the couple in 1902 decided to move to Niles. Now, we're not sure exactly why. We're speculating here, but William's brother Henry had made some money in the lumber business also in South Bend and had a place on Diamond Lake. And so William visited Henry during the summer. So we think that he probably was aware of the house because the Michigan Central stopped in Niles. So they move into the house, they refurbish it. It was nicely landscaped. It was at the corner of Grant and Broadway. Yeah, okay, it was the corner of Grant and Broadway. And it was originally the Colby House. And a guy named G.A. Colby had built it in 1863. Now, he had prospered selling flour to the Army during the Civil War. Another side note is that he had a bakery in Niles that made a rather famous item called Niles Crackers, which they sold in barrels. In 1870, he left Niles to pursue mining interests out west. And the house went through about 4 different hands until the Dresdens bought it in 1902. Now, they lived there until they both died. Now, Adele was very active in philanthropic things. She was the first president of the Niles chapter of the Women's Progressive League. She was a president of the Berrien County Humane Society. She was in the Eastern Star and various other things. And I might note that the Women's League, one of their first things on their agenda was a city park, which ended up being Island Park, and the Dresdens bought the land and paid for the money to clear it. Unfortunately, she became the president of the Women's Progressive League in 1912. She died in 1915. She was diabetic. William died in 1924. Their daughter Plowden then inherited the estate. Now, she was by then married and living in Detroit, so she sold the house. Francis and Jenny Plim bought the house. Now, it must be noted that at that time, Niles did not have a public hospital. I mean, there were a couple of smaller private ones, and they were totally inundated in the 1918 flu epidemic, in which case they had to put patients in churches, in the Chapin Mansion, and so forth. And so there was a need for a public hospital. So the Plim stepped up and said, all right, we'll donate the house if you can raise $10,000 for the refurbishing it to make it a hospital. Well, the city had various fundraising activities and didn't get quite to 10,000, but they got to north of 9,500. And so they accepted a bid from an architect in South Bend to refurbish it. And in November of 1926, Pulaski Hospital opened. And of course, over the years, there's been additions. I think they pretty much rebuilt it in the 1990s, and it's a part of Corewell Health now. So, any questions?
How many people were born at Plotting Hospital? We asked this on our Riverwalk. All right, yeah. I know lots of people remember the hospital. Thank you, John. I will also point out that Adele was the first president of the Women's Progressive League. They made the first park in Niles. They were also very active in the suffrage movement, and they were part of the county suffrage movement. And after the women got the right to vote, they went door to door registering women to vote after that. That was a big part of what the Progressive League did too. Okay, it is raining pretty hard right now. So I think we're going to go down on this main road. I'm going to point out Benny Cousins, but I think we start heading back toward that refreshment table. How's that sound to you guys? Let's do this. If you look at the photos on the History Center website, I will say Benny Cousins Jr. kind of inspired where we were going on the tour this year. We were going through the collections at the museum, and we found a photo that was in the South Bend Tribune in the 70s of two children putting flowers at Benny Cousins' grave. And it kind of led us into wanting to do a little more research about him and to find out about his family. So we found out a little about his Spanish-American War service, and we found out, his dad served in the 102nd as well. So I really wanted to highlight him. That picture is on our website. It's raining really hard, so I won't pull the tablet out right now. But I definitely recommend checking that out. All right, let's head back, guys.
Okay.